this video, I'm going to teach you how to be a better bassoonist in an ensemble, whether it be a band, an orchestra, or even a chamber ensemble like a small group of people. I know a lot of you play in community ensembles, community bands, community orchestras, or maybe you play in a school ensemble with other students just like you. So in this video, you're going to learn about how to be a better team player so that you can help the whole ensemble sound as good as possible. If we're just meeting for the first time, my name is Dr. Natalie Law, and I'm a professional bassoonist and teacher, and I love to help people just like you get better at the bassoon, whether you're a beginner or a much more advanced player. So on this channel, I give you tips, tools, and strategies for being a better bassoonist. So if you are not already, be sure you're subscribed to the channel. Make sure you like this video and comment down below any questions you have about anything that I'm going to talk about today. So the first tip I'm going to give you about being a better ensemble player has to do with blend. That's the main difference between playing by yourself individually as a solo player and playing with a group of people, is that as a group, whether it's a small group or a large group, you have to have a cohesive sound and a cohesive blend. And you don't want anybody sticking out when it's not intentional. You want the whole group to sound as one. So the main thing that you always want to keep in mind is, how am I blending into the group to make a good group sound? So there's a lot of things that we can talk about with blend. It's a topic that could be its own video and that we could spend a lot of time talking about. So as a bassoonist, I'm primarily going to talk about blending with other woodwind players, because typically, whether you're in a band, orchestra, or in a chamber ensemble, you're typically sitting next to other woodwind players, and you have the most control in terms of playing with these other instrumentalists. So clarinetists, flutists, oboists, sometimes saxophonists if you're playing in a band. Learning how to blend with the people around you is really important. The one thing that's kind of unique about woodwinds as compared to string players or brass players is that all of the woodwinds within the woodwind family are so different from one another. Some of us play with reeds, some of us don't. Some of our instruments are actually made of wood, others are made of metal. And so we produce sound in different ways, and we have vastly different sounds. So I think woodwind players in particular have the biggest struggle in trying to blend together. And so as a bassoonist, it's our job to try and find ways to blend with these other people. A general tip that I have to be able to blend with other people is to think about becoming that person's sound. So for example, if you are playing a sort of duet line with a clarinet player, you want to think about what can you do in your sound to sound more like a clarinet player. Typically, clarinetists do not play with vibrato, and so you generally want to avoid playing with vibrato in your sound with a clarinetist, because you want to have a nice group blend sound. And typically as double reed players, we have sometimes a little bit more edge to our sound, and we're a little bit more bright, and the clarinet has a little bit more mellow and warm sound. And so we want to make sure to mellow up and warm our sound so that it fits within the clarinet sound. I like to actually think, if I was, if the instrument that I was holding in my hand was a clarinet, then what would it sound like? Like, as much as a bassoon can possibly sound like a clarinet, what can I do? And you'll be surprised to notice that you can really change your tone a lot. It's not so much about technical things, it's more about envisioning, how do I sound like this other person? And ideally, both you and that clarinet player are thinking the same thing. So the clarinet player is thinking, how can I brighten my sound a little bit so that I match the bassoon player, and so on. Now, playing with a clarinet player is different than playing with a flute player. So a flute player definitely uses vibrato. In fact, flute players tend to use a lot more vibrato in their sound than bassoon players. So if you have like a duet in like an orchestra piece with a flute player, you're definitely going to want to use vibrato. And the flute player, because they're usually in a much higher register than you, they don't have as much trouble projecting through the orchestra. And so you are probably going to have to come up in volume to match the flute player because they're going to be able to cut through. When you're playing with a flute player, you're not only thinking, how can I make my sound more like the flute sound and using vibrato, you're also thinking, okay, I have to match volume with what they're doing. Consequently, if you're playing with a flute player who's playing in their very bottom register, if you've ever heard the flute play in the low register, you'll notice they can't play very loud. They can't project very much. So you have to listen to the music and see if they're playing in their really low register and you can't really hear them, then you don't want to actually play that loud because they can't project as much. So, but depending on the instrument that you're playing with, you're going to have to think about what problems are they dealing with and how can I accommodate them in my playing to help them out. I think oboe players are some of the easiest instruments to blend with because we both play double reeds, and so we both tend to have similar tendencies in our playing. The attack of our notes tends to be a little bit more on and off, whereas, flute and clarinet players, they can have a softer attack to their articulations, whereas bassoon and oboe, it's sort of off or on sometimes, depending on the register. And oboists tend to have a similar tendency to bassoonist, where it's very difficult to play soft in the low register. And so I know if I'm playing with an oboist and they're playing what's in their low register, and whether I'm playing in my low register or not, I want to be able to match and maybe not get too soft so that they don't feel like they're sticking out like a sore thumb. So all these things we're thinking about, how can I accommodate what that instrument can and cannot do so that we can sound together as a whole. Ultimately, you want the sound to be not just an oboe and a bassoon, or a clarinet and bassoon, or a flute and bassoon. You want it to be a brand new sound that both of you create together that's unique. That's the point of playing together, is that you're able to create new and different sounds more so than you can by yourself as an individual. One other thing to keep in mind, especially when we're thinking about playing with other woodwind players, is about articulation. So I talked a little bit about how with oboe and bassoon that, articulation tends to match. Well, going back to the clarinet usually can't stop the sound quite as quickly as the bassoon. Bassoon and oboe, double reed players, we tend to play, very short staccato passages very easily, whereas, clarinetists and sometimes flute players have trouble playing short staccato as short as we can. So for example, if you're playing maybe a trio with a flute, clarinet, and you, the bassoonist, and you're playing something that has a staccato passage in it, you're always going to be able to play more short and dry than the other two instruments. They can't possibly match as short as we can play. And so, especially the clarinet, they have a lot of ring to their sound at the end of the note, and it's really difficult for them to, shorten up that sound. So we have to think, okay, who am I playing with? I know I can play it as short as possible, but I know that they can't. In order to have a good sound, we all want to match our articulation lengths. So I'm going to play my staccatos a little bit longer than I would if I was playing by myself so that we can all three sound good. And there's things that if they're good players, they're going to be doing similar things in their playing to match your sound. So ideally, you're all working together. And honestly, these are conversations that you can have in rehearsal. Even if you're in a large group at rehearsal breaks, you can turn to these people and say, hey, it sounds like we're having trouble matching in this particular section. So can you maybe play a little bit longer, or could you play a little bit louder? Sometimes I will say that if I'm playing a passage with a clarinetist who can play very softly, and maybe it's notes that tend to stick out for me and it's hard for me to play softer, I'll sometimes say, hey, do you mind playing that just a little bit louder, just so that I feel a little bit more supported and we can match more. Absolutely, these are conversations you want to make sure that you're having with your peers all the time. I have mostly talked about blending with other woodwind players because, like I said, usually we're sitting close to woodwind players and it's easy for us to hear each other and talk to each other. And also woodwind players, I think we have the most struggle with blend because our instruments are so different all within our own family. But the same principles apply no matter whether you're playing with strings, brass, or even percussion. So as bassoon players, we often share lines with the low brass, the trombones and the tubas. The low brass in particular tend to be able to play pretty loud. So if you're sharing a line with, say, the trombones, and usually there's 3 of them at least, usually you can play a little bit louder because you know that they're probably going to bury your sound as a bassoonist. And the same thing with articulation. Brass players usually can't get quite as short and clean of articulation as, say, double reed players can. And so that's another thing where we want to make sure we lengthen articulation to match their sound. Brass players tend to have a little bit sort of rounder, bigger sound. And so we have to figure out how can we round our sound out to fit within their sound. And a lot of times, unfortunately, because brass players are often sitting behind us in the ensemble, is we have to listen back because it's really hard for people behind us to hear forward. And so we have to kind of go with whatever they're going. So if they're creating a certain type of sound and it's kind of difficult to talk to them in between, rehearsal and whatnot, you kind of have to go with what they're playing because a lot of times they can't hear you and they're playing a lot louder than you are. So it's just best to kind of match. Sometimes it's frustrating because, we have disagreements about how something should sound, or we don't feel like they're playing something correctly. And without having, sort of a direct conversation with those people, it's sometimes not worth, going to all the trouble. So really try to focus on like the woodwinds and the people sitting near you. Another big topic when it comes to ensemble playing is tuning. And tuning really goes hand in hand with blend. I mean, you really can't think about tuning by itself without also thinking about blend. But there are some specific things to keep in mind when we're tuning. So in case you didn't know, typically at the beginning of rehearsal, when somebody, usually the oboe player, plays a tuning note, usually it's a tuning A. If you're in a band, it might be a B flat or an F or another note. As bassoonists, we can't adjust our tuning on the fly with our instrument. A really common misconception is that, we can just pull out or push in our vocal to be able to tune. And it's just not the case, because the main reason for this is that your vocal has to hit this whisper key pad, and it only has about that much of space. And when you're talking about all of this tubing on the bassoon, like 8 feet or so of tubing, that little bit of space doesn't make much of a difference. On top of that, the vocal, fits in the receiver a certain way. So sometimes when you pull the vocal out, it gets really loose and you just can't expect to be able to play like that. So you might ask, well, how do I adjust tuning? All these other instrumentalists are, pulling out or pushing in things on their instrument to be able to play in tune, but what am I supposed to do? What's the point of tuning? Well, the tuning all happens with you and with the reed. Ideally, you are playing on a reed that is playing in tune and it just does the work for you, and you might have to make small adjustments in your embouchure and in your voicing here and there. But for the most part, we can't really change much in our tuning. So if a band director tells you, oh, bassoons, you need to adjust your vocal to tune, that's completely wrong. Just ignore them, because we can't change anything on our instrument really to change our intonation. So we just have to be sure that we're always playing with good reeds. I say it all the time, make sure that you're playing reeds handmade by professional bassoonists. I'll link down to my reeds in the description if you'd like to purchase from me, or just make sure that you're purchasing reeds from somebody who knows what they're doing. And so come to rehearsal with good reeds and you will be able to play in tune. Another tuning topic, of course, is not just ourselves being in tune, but being able to tune with other people in the ensemble. That's really, really difficult, and it takes a lot of time and skills to be able to develop your ear, to be able to hear what in tune sounds like, and to be able to adjust your intonation on the fly to match other people. Tuning is another topic that I could spend a whole video talking about. Let me know if you'd like me to do something like that in the comments, but I'll just kind of briefly talk about a couple tips and points to think about with tuning. So in an ensemble, typically as bassoon players, we are the bass voice in the ensemble, or the tenor voice, or we're down low in the low register. Especially in the woodwind section, we are sort of the supporting role for the entire woodwind section, because no one else, unless maybe a bass clarinet player, is playing down in our register. So typically when we're playing the roots and the fifths of chords, which are sort of the foundation of tuning. And so it's really important that whenever we're playing, that we're trying to be as close to green as possible. Green meaning in tune on a tuner, because everybody else who's playing other members of the chord, or maybe they're playing an octave above us, they have to be able to find that pitch. And if we're playing, consistently sharp or consistently flat, it's really hard for other people to play these other chord members and adjust when we're not quite solid. So it's really important in your personal practicing to consistently use a tuner and do exercises that develop your ear and develop your ability to adjust pitch, so that when you come to rehearsal, you are able to hear and adjust on the fly. And if you want to dive more into this, I recommend you check out my warm-up video where I talk about long tones in particular, which I think are some of the best exercises you can do to improve your own ear and your own sense of intonation on your own instrument. So the better that you come to rehearsal, the better the ensemble is going to be, because you're going to know your tendencies and how to adjust for those tendencies. So playing in tune as the bass voice of the ensemble is really important. But the bassoons are often, especially in a big ensemble, we're often not the only bass voice, right? So if you're playing in an orchestra, the low brass section, the trombones, the tuba, the low strings, cello and bass, sometimes bass clarinet, or if you're playing in a band, like tenor and bass saxophone will be sharing parts with you. So there's a lot of different people usually that are spread out throughout the ensemble that are playing often the same part as you. You have to match them as best as possible. And that's some of the most frustrating parts of playing in an ensemble, I think, is when there's multiple people in way different places around the ensemble, and we can usually hear each other, but it's so hard to communicate and stay together. And again, that listening back idea is kind of the thing we have to go with, especially if there's a tuba player in the ensemble. A tuba player is often going to be like the go-to pitch. Wherever the tuba player is putting it, that's where it's got to be. So a lot of times we might share a line with a tuba player, but not always. So you always want to listen down. The bass voices, particularly the tuba or the string bass, are kind of the people that are setting it, whether it's right or wrong. So that's where a lot of frustration comes out in ensembles is, we get frustrated that, I can't play in tune because, the people playing the bass part are not in tune. And so you just have to go with whatever they're doing, because you can't always fix that. Sometimes you can have conversations on rehearsal breaks. You can say in a very polite, friendly manner, I'm having a hard time finding where you're at. Do you mind if we try playing that passage together? You can be really polite and collegial with your colleagues to try and play it as best as you can together. It not only helps to be able to tune your individual notes to be on green, it also really helps to know how to tune thirds and fifths in particular in ensembles, because usually there's multiple people, whether it's you or other people playing those chord members, it helps to know. And so, for example, when you are playing the root of a chord and maybe someone else is playing the third of the chord, that third, to sound really good in tune, has to be just a little bit flat. The third itself has to be a little bit flat to what would on green be with a tuner to sound good with the root. The way that you start to hear that in your own individual practicing is if you practice with drones. You have a drone, maybe you can look up like cello drones on YouTube and have the drone playing a note that they just hold over a long period of time, and then you play different notes to that. So for example, if the drone is on C, that's, the root pitch, that would mean that you're probably in C major. So in your own practice session, have the drone on C go in your headphones and listen to that, and then play an E to that C, because an E would be the third to the in C major to the C, and the E, if you put it on green with a tuner in front of you, it's going to sound a little bit sharp, and so you actually need to put the third a little bit low. And so, because you'll notice if you bend the pitch with the drone, that it'll sound best when the third is just a little bit low. Consequently, if you're playing a minor third, so if you're playing an E flat to that C, the E flat needs to sit a little bit high. So you want to raise the pitch from where it is on green. Usually the fifth sounds best if it's just a little bit wide. So the fifth will just be just a touch sharp to the root in order to sound really good in just tuning. Practicing those, specifically the thirds and fifth chord members with drones in your own personal practice, you can do it in your warm-up routine, is really going to help you develop your ear and figure out how do you adjust certain chord members and how do you help accommodate other people who would be playing those chords in the ensemble. And that takes a long time to develop. If you've never done any of this sort of tuning work with drones, then it's going to take a long time to figure it out. But that's how you do it, is you figure out how does it sound good, and then when you're in the ensemble, how do you adjust your playing to match and sound good with other people. So again, tuning is a whole big can of worms that we could talk about. There's many more topics of tuning. So let me know what questions you have down in the comments, and maybe I could go into more detail on tuning in another video. But that is another big consideration when you're playing in an ensemble, is how do I tune and sound good with other people? Another big aspect of playing in an ensemble with other people is being able to play together in time, at the same time, at the right time. That's some of the biggest struggle, right? Is being able to play all at the same time when you're supposed to. And you might have struggled before that if maybe you share the same part with other instruments in the ensemble, that sometimes you don't always play them together. You have disagreements about where exactly things are supposed to line up. And, that's where the rehearsal comes in, as you figure out, how do I play these things with other people? So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the woodwind section again, because again, usually we're sitting closest to other woodwind players and we have the most control and influence within the woodwind section. But certainly everything I'm talking about does apply to the whole ensemble. So for example, in an orchestra, typically, so if you're playing in an orchestra, usually the woodwind section is in 2 rows. You have bassoons are in the sort of back left corner, clarinets, then we have oboes and flutes. So bassoon, clarinet in 1 row, oboes and flutes in the front row. And I know if you're in a band, it's going to look differently, but in an orchestra, that's pretty much the standard universal setup. So we can hear the clarinets the most, so it's usually very easy to blend with the clarinets. So for example, if you're playing a duet with a clarinet, or you're playing a big section that's bassoons and clarinets together, it really helps if you can breathe together. Even if the conductor is up front cueing you, it helps if you can go and breathe together. You don't have to have a super audible breath, but having some sense of breathing and then playing gives everyone around you a sense of security that, okay, this person is coming in on this note, so I'm going to come in on this note too. So breathing together is really important, and not just breathing together, but moving together. And moving when you're playing is kind of another can of worms topic, because people have different approaches. Some people think that you should not really move much at all when you're playing. Some people think that you should move a lot when you're playing. So there's different sort of ideas and approaches about it. But I do think that moving when you're playing, when you're about to play, cueing other people around you who are playing the same thing, can be really helpful and sometimes essential to being able to play together. Certainly if you're playing in a bassoon section where there are other people around you and maybe you're playing first bassoon, it helps to cue people. So cueing on the bassoon is another topic that, again, I could go on a whole other tangent in another video talking about cueing, because it takes a lot of time and practice to figure out. So again, let me know if you want more information about it. But essentially, bassoon cueing is not as simple and straightforward as, say, clarinetist cueing or oboist cueing, where they're just cueing breathe, play, up and down, because we have this big awkward instrument in front of us, right? So typically the motion for cueing, and it depends person to person, is breathe, play. So, and you have to think about your bassoon being kind of like a giant baton, when you're watching a conductor in front of you, these points that they're playing at, these are the ictus points. When the conductor's hands change direction, that's the ictus. That is how you know when to play at that particular beat. It's the same idea when you're playing instruments, that we want to be able to see a clear ictus when you're cueing. And so for bassoon, it's usually easiest when you breathe, play, breathe, play, breathe, play. So with the bassoon, breathe, play, breathe, play. Every instrument, like I said, clarinets, oboes, bassoons, flutes, we all cue differently. And so learning how your peers cue around you, if other people are cueing, is helpful to know, like, where exactly is their ictus point going to be, so that I know how to play with them. And usually it's kind of like out of the corner of your eye. It's not like you're looking at the person next to you. It's usually just sort of an awareness. So that's where the breath comes in. So breathing together, moving together is going to ensure that everybody is playing at the same time, at the right time. And that leads me perfectly into this next topic, which is a suggestion that I have for you if you want to be a better ensemble player, is to play chamber music. So chamber music means small groups, usually at least 2 people up to 10 people, or just smaller groups, not large ensembles. Chamber music is a really great way to learn how to play with other people and learn how other instruments work, because usually it's very easy to communicate with each other, and it's very easy to see each other up close, because usually you're sitting in a small arc, and it's easier to work together that way. And in chamber rehearsals, it's all about how to play together, because you don't have a conductor who's up there showing you where the beats are. And so you just have to have an internal pulse, just as you should with a large ensemble, but especially in chamber music, you have to have an internal pulse of where the beat is going. And you have to be able to show when you're going to play with other people. I highly recommend that if you don't already, find some friends that you really like to play with. It really doesn't matter what instruments they play, because you can always play different arrangements and make things work. But find some friends to play with, and set up a regular rehearsal, maybe a once a week or once every other week rehearsal schedule, and just meet and play chamber music together, because it's fun to do that. And it also makes all of you better players. I play regularly with a professional woodwind quintet called Pure Winds, and we have an album out on streaming platforms if you want to check that out. But this is one of my favorite groups to play with, because they really force me to be a better player, because in chamber music, your part is a lot more exposed. There's a lot more going on. And so you have to be really responsible for your music and come really prepared to rehearsals, so that you all have a good experience. And that's some of my favorite playing, and also being able to play with people that I love and love to hang out with is a really fun and rewarding experience. Some of my favorite playing is chamber music. I just love playing in small groups, because you get a lot more exposed on the spot stuff, but it's more interesting than simply just solo music, in my opinion. So I have one last tip for you for how to be a better ensemble player. And this is a topic that commonly comes up, especially in like community ensembles or school ensembles, where you have people who are coming in at different levels and different backgrounds and different experiences and attitudes towards the music. You might have people in your group who are gung-ho musicians and want to be the absolute best and are super interested in making the music as perfect as possible. And you might have people in your group who are just there just because they want to hang out with their friends, or they just, they like to make sound with their instrument, but they're not always particularly interested in being the absolute best that they can be. So sometimes that can be frustrating, especially in community ensembles where people have, different levels of experience as well. And I think that you just have to go into those ensembles knowing that, because if you go in expecting everybody to be at the same level as you and expecting everybody to have the same attitude as you do, you'll just be disappointed. So find the people in the ensemble who maybe have the same approach to the ensemble as you do. Maybe they also want to work on their playing and play with you and be better, and really latch on to those relationships. So like, for example, if you have a good friend who's playing in the flute section who really wants to work on playing together better, whenever you guys play things together, make sure that it's, talk about it and make it better and practice it on rehearsal breaks. And say if you are consistently playing with the trombones and the trombones are a hot mess, there's not a whole lot you can do about that unless you're close friends with those people. And so you just have to know, okay, when I'm playing with the trombones, it's not going to be the most rewarding, satisfying experience, but when I get to play with my flute player friend who sees things the same way as I do, then it's going to be a really rewarding experience. So there are always going to be those differences and frustrations in the ensemble, and I really encourage you to just go in with an open mind and just know that people are playing for different reasons, no matter what ensemble you're in, and just be open to those different experiences and do your best to just be a good team player, bring your best playing, and just do the best you can with what you've got. I hope this video was helpful for you. If it was, I would love if you give me a thumbs up and make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and let me know any questions down in the comments. I always love to hear about ideas for video topics or questions or comments that you guys have. So please let me know what's on your mind.